April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above northern France. The thin morning air shimmered with sunlight, the clouds breaking apart like fragile glass over the occupied continent. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermacken adjusted his oxygen mask inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5. His eyes narrowed on the horizon. There, just below the German formation, he could see them. 16 massive aircraft heaving their way upward, their engines straining against the unforgiving sky. Amerikanische Milchflaschen, he laughed into his radio. Flying milk bottles. His wingman chuckled back, the laughter echoing across the Luftwaffe channel. To the Germans circling above, the newcomers were comical, almost embarrassing. Barrel-shaped fuselages that looked too heavy to fight. Canopies like greenhouses, propellers that seemed absurdly oversized. Compared to the elegant Spitfires or the nimble Soviet Yakovlevs, these machines looked like lumbering giants out of place in the heavens. But below, inside those cockpits, the Americans weren't laughing. Sweat pooled beneath leather helmets. Hands gripped throttles until knuckles turned white. For the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, this was their first real combat mission in Europe. They were flying the brand new Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft so big, so heavy, so utterly alien to everything they had been trained on, that many privately doubted if it belonged in a dogfight at all. At 7 tons, the Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared with 2,000 horsepower, but even that seemed barely enough to drag its bulk toward the thin air of high altitude. To the Luftwaffe pilots, circling like wolves above, these American machines looked like easy prey. What Hermacken and his fellow Germans did not know, what none of them could possibly have guessed, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the very weapon that would, in less than 2 years, break the spine of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. June 1940, Farmingdale, New York. The United States was not yet at war, but the storm clouds over Europe cast long shadows across the Atlantic. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. And the U.S. Army Air Corps was suddenly desperate. They needed a fighter that could survive against the Messerschmitt Bf-109s and the Focke-Wulf 190s sweeping the skies. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer at Republic Aviation, sat hunched over his drafting table in Farmingdale. When the Army handed him their specifications, he frowned. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor, light, agile, able to climb fast and turn tighter than the Luftwaffe's killers. Kartveli looked at the paper, then shook his head. "Gentlemen," he told his team, "we cannot build a Spitfire. America does not build fragile birds. We build engines. We build power. If they want a fighter, we will give them a dinosaur. But a dinosaur with good proportions." And so the XP-47B was born, a beast unlike anything the world had seen. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty weight, it was heavier than some bombers. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced thunder when it roared to life. Test pilots approaching it for the first time stared wide-eyed. This thing actually flies. When it did, the results were shocking. At altitude, where German fighters began to gasp for oxygen, the Thunderbolt kept climbing, its turbo supercharger system feeding the engine as if it was still at sea level. At 30,000 feet, it could still unleash its full 2,000 horsepower. But this power came at a price. In training, the P-47 was merciless. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in accidents alone. The Thunderbolt would torque roll violently on takeoff, ground loop on landing, and dive so fast that pilots discovered compressibility, a terrifying new phenomenon where shock waves froze their controls mid-air. It killed more Americans in training than Germans would in the first months of combat. Pilots cursed it, calling it the Jug for its jug-shaped fuselage. Many begged to be transferred back to the nimble Spitfires, and yet those who mastered it found something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, remembered strapping himself in for the first time. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The Americans had built something new, not a dancer, but a brawler. Not elegance, but brute force. A weapon that would change the mathematics of aerial combat forever. The year is still 1942, deep into the brutal Eastern Front. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, winter has tightened its grip. Food is gone, hope is thin, and survival has become a battle of will as much as weapons. German soldiers huddle in shattered buildings, frost clinging to their uniforms, their rifles icy to the touch. Soviet troops push through alleys and basements, fighting not just for a city, but for revenge, for homeland, for pride. The city has become a graveyard of steel and bone. The Volga River lies frozen, a silent witness to the screams of men echoing between bombed-out walls. Inside one ruined factory, a squad of Red Army soldiers waits, listening for German footsteps in the snow. Every corner hides danger. Every shadow could mean death. This was no ordinary battle anymore. It was a siege of souls where hunger, fear, and cold killed as much as bullets. November 19th, 1942. The snow fell thick and merciless across the steppe, covering everything in a pale shroud. On this day, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a counteroffensive that would turn the tide of the Eastern Front. Thousands of Red Army soldiers surged forward, their bayonets gleaming under the grey skies, while tanks rolled through frozen ground that cracked beneath their weight. Inside the shattered city of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army still believed it could hold its ground. They had fought for months in the ruins, street by street, room by room, but the storm that descended upon them was unlike anything they had faced. Within days, the Soviets encircled the city. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers, along with Romanian and Italian allies, were trapped inside a steel ring. At first, the men of the Wehrmacht tried to stay hopeful. The Luftwaffe promised supplies by air. Each day, soldiers looked up, waiting for the buzz of engines above the clouds. Crates tied to parachutes drifted down, but most fell far from reach. Some landed in Soviet lines, others shattered in the snow. Hunger spread through the ranks like a silent plague. Bread rations shrank to crumbs, and men chewed leather straps or boiled wallpaper paste just to fill their stomachs. The winter cold was merciless. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Dead soldiers were left frozen in the streets, their bodies becoming landmarks in the white wasteland. And still the Soviets tightened their grip. From every direction came artillery fire and the howling storm of Katyusha rockets. The German soldiers, once filled with confidence, now whispered the same thought in every trench and bunker. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting to survive. January 1943. The siege had lasted for months. What began as a confident German advance into the heart of Russia had turned into a nightmare frozen in ice and blood. The Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, was reduced to shadows of men. Trapped inside Stalingrad, they faced not just the Soviet guns, but starvation, disease, and the slow unraveling of human will. The city was unrecognizable. Whole districts were nothing more than broken skeletons of factories and apartments. Smoke lingered over the ruins, even in the dead of winter, as Soviet artillery rained down day and night. Every street had become a graveyard. Corpses, German, Romanian, Italian, Soviet, lay half-buried in snowdrifts, frozen solid, their faces locked in expressions of terror or despair. The once proud German soldiers no longer looked like an army. Their uniforms were rags. Their helmets sat loosely on heads that had grown gaunt and hollow from hunger. Food had disappeared. The bread ration was barely a handful. Horses had been slaughtered long ago, their bones boiled into thin soup. Men tore wallpaper off walls to scrape the paste, or chewed belts and leather boots for the taste of something, anything. Frostbite claimed toes, fingers, ears. In the frozen bunkers beneath the ruins, doctors worked without medicine. Amputations were done with saws and knives, with no anesthetic, just the screams of soldiers echoing in the darkness. Lice infested every coat, every blanket. Typhus spread like wildfire. For many, death by disease came before death by bullet. The Soviets knew the army was broken, but they did not relent. Their attacks grew bolder, their artillery heavier. The Red Army closed in from every side, the ring tightening day after day. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army there was no way out. They had been promised rescue. They had been told the Luftwaffe would save them. But the skies had betrayed them. Supplies had failed. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, sat in his headquarters, listening to reports of collapse. His men begged for surrender. But surrender was forbidden by Hitler's orders. The Sixth Army will hold its ground to the last man and the last bullet, the Führer commanded from far away, safe in Berlin. By late January, the Sixth Army was shattered. Units disappeared into silence. Soldiers wandered the ruins like ghosts, their rifles useless, their eyes vacant. Some broke down completely, curling up in the snow and waiting for death. Others tried to surrender, stumbling towards Soviet lines with hands raised, only to be cut down by artillery fire. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus himself was surrounded. Soviet troops stormed his command post in the ruined department store of Stalingrad. The once proud field marshal sat slumped, exhausted, broken, his uniform filthy and torn. For the first time in his life, Hitler had promoted a man to field marshal, expecting him to commit suicide rather than be captured. Paulus did not. He surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, 1943, the last pockets of German resistance collapsed. The great Sixth Army, over 280,000 men, was gone. Only a fraction, sick, frozen, starving, stumbled into Soviet captivity. Few of them would ever see home again. The battle was over. Stalingrad had consumed them all. This was not just the fall of an army. It was the turning point of the war. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Across the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the world saw that the tide had turned, and the nightmare of the Eastern Front was only beginning. February 1943. The guns at Stalingrad had fallen silent, but the echoes of the battle would shake the world for generations. The Soviet victory was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, the world saw that the Wehrmacht, once considered unstoppable, could be defeated. Stalingrad was the turning point. Out of the 280,000 men who marched into the city, only about 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany, most perishing in Soviet labor camps from starvation, disease, or exhaustion. The Sixth Army, the pride of Hitler, was no more. For the German people, the loss was shattering. Propaganda had promised invincibility, swift victories, and endless glory. But the reality had been exposed in the frozen ruins of a Russian city whose name was now burned into history. Mothers, wives, and children in Germany received telegrams, one after another, announcing that their sons, their husbands, their brothers were never coming home. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. The Red Army had bled terribly, over 1 million casualties in the battle alone. Entire divisions had been annihilated, yet through hunger, through cold, through fire and rubble, they had endured. And in enduring, they had turned the tide. Hitler's aura of invincibility cracked that winter. His generals had begged him to allow Paulus to retreat, but his pride would not allow it. Instead, his stubbornness condemned an entire army. Even his promotion of Paulus to field marshal, an unspoken command to commit suicide rather than surrender, had failed. Instead of a heroic martyr, Hitler was left with a captured commander, a man broken by defeat. The myth of the German blitzkrieg, of unstoppable armored thrusts and lightning victories, ended at Stalingrad. From that point on, Germany was on the defensive. The Eastern Front, once an endless advance, became a desperate retreat. But Stalingrad was more than strategy. It was a story of human suffering on a scale almost beyond imagination. Soldiers freezing in ruins, civilians starved and bombed into shadows, families destroyed forever. It was a place where history paused and showed humanity both its deepest cruelty and its strongest resilience. Even decades later, the name Stalingrad carries weight. It has become shorthand for hopelessness, for sacrifice, for the breaking point of empires. The ruins have been rebuilt, the city renamed Volgograd, but the memory remains. The ghosts of that battle still linger in history's pages, whispering of what happens when ambition, pride, and cruelty consume nations. Stalingrad was not just the fall of an army. It was the beginning of the fall of the Third Reich.